Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the 9th annual Martin Luther King Jr. Prayer Breakfast for the Greater Des Moines YMCA. It is brought to you by Nationwide. This is going to be a great prayer breakfast as we usually have, and I want you all to know that you are in for a treat. Next up, we will have Leisha Farkas of the CEO of the Greater Des Moines YMCA.
Good morning, and thank you so much for being here today. It's a very special day, and we come together to celebrate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I especially want to thank Nationwide this morning, our presenting sponsor, for supporting this event for 9 years in a row, along with our I Have a Dream sponsor, Meredith, and our community builder sponsors, Athene, Bankers Trust, and the Iowa Wolves. The diversity and inclusion advocates and committee members at each of these organizations should also be recognized for standing alongside us in solidarity of today's message. You know, before civil rights champion and humanitarian Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led the Montgomery bus boycott, delivered his I Have a Dream speech, or won the Nobel Peace Prize, Martin Luther King Jr. was a child who found a second home at the YMCA. As a boy, he learned to swim at the Y in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. The YMCA's role in youth development is historic and unwavering, a resolute that is significantly important, maybe now more than ever. This last July, McKinsey & Company published results of a study showing the impact of the pandemic on K through 12 learning. Students on average were 5 months behind in mathematics and 4 months behind in reading. On top of that, the pandemic hit historically disadvantaged students the hardest. In math, students in majority Black schools ended the year with 6 months of unfinished learning. Students in low-income schools with 7. High schoolers have been even more likely to drop out of school, and high school seniors from low-income families are less likely to go on to post-secondary education. This crisis has had an impact on not just academics, but also the broader health and well-being of our youth. Over 35% of parents now say they are very concerned about their children's mental health. However, with the help of our community, our YMCA is delivering support to local students to make up for their unfinished learning, work with broader mental health issues, and help with social reintegration. For example, this year, the YMCA's Summer Learning Loss program in our city's core has raised the reading score of 181 students. And the Y's health and wellness agenda is supporting the physical and mental health needs of our kids. Just like adults, children are experiencing stress, depression, and anxiety at elevated levels. And we know exercise is a great way to combat those feelings. Increasing a child's physical activity level is also directly related to performance in math and reading. The YMCA's youth sports programs for all ages are back in full swing. The youngest kids are playing rookie sports or experiencing yoga alongside their parents. Well over 1,000 middle-aged schoolgirls are gaining confidence and becoming physically fit through Girls on the Run. And over 200 young men right now are who are not engaged in their home high school sports activities are getting to experience the benefits of basketball through the Y's Metro League, thanks to the Iowa Wolves and the staff at the John R. Grubb Y. As CEO of the YMCA, I am very proud to represent an organization that works to transform youth by strengthening their spirits, minds, and bodies. While we provide these opportunities, we don't do this work alone. Donors, committed teachers, staff, and hundreds of volunteer coaches throughout our community are the ones really making the difference. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. So I want to thank everyone on the call today serving the community's youth in the name of Martin Luther King Jr. I hope you all have a very full and blessed day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Leisha, for those opening remarks. Next, we'll have Pastor Ben Bell with our opening prayer.
Good morning and welcome to the 9th annual MLK breakfast virtually. I am Dr. Benjamin Bell Jr. I am the Fatherhood Outreach Director at the John R. Grubb YMCA, and I was asked to offer a word of prayer. And for the purpose of context, I would like to frame the invocation by taking your attention to the bottom southwest corner of the building where I work. There's a Latin saying there. It's engraved right there in the stone, and it's mens sana in corpore sano. It was placed there in 1940, and it simply means a sound mind in a sound body. When a body is sound, it operates at a unit. The joints supply whatever that body part needs to function as it was designed to. On March 28th, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King needed a part of the American body to encourage him, as he had written a speech, and it wasn't quite hitting the mark in terms of how Mahalia Jackson felt. She yelled out, "Martin, tell them about the dream. Tell them about the dream." That woman caused him to shift his message and talk about what was really in his heart to say that day. She did that with unfailing persuasion, and she told him, "You just do what was in your heart." This is what's amazing about that. She supplied Dr. King with the courage he needed that day to touch the heart of our nation, and caused us to envision a nation that would judge people based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. So today I pray that we will be impacted by this day. I ask the Father to light or rekindle the flame of faith that drives people to lift all humanity with equity. I pray that you will live with active courage and conviction. I pray that you will spend the rest of your lives contagiously communicating the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. This is my prayer for us this day. God bless you and love to all.
Thank you so much for that prayer, Dr. Ben Bell. Up next, we have a video from the Iowa Wolves. And in this video, it's talking about the voices of the community. And there were some community leaders that were asked, what does Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day mean to you?
It's an important day to me because when I think about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's his rich legacy and everything that he stood for, the fighting for civil rights, the fighting to eliminate systemic racism, the advocating for economic justice and that. He was a person who stood for public service.
MLK Day means for me, I think it's just a shift away from all the divisiveness, demonization of certain communities, whether it's immigrants or refugees, racism, discrimination.
He was about racial justice and equity, but really at its core, I think he was really about humanity.
Him waking up every day, knowing that step by step it was going to get better. It wasn't easy, but he fought each and every day for us to have equal rights. So, that really sticks out for us.
What he was calling us to is more than just to dream, but to be people of action and to put into practice what he was preaching.
All the things that he led in his life and all the accomplishments is really, really, really important. But it's also just, a lot more people should definitely know about MLK, and all the accomplishments and things that he did over his lifetime.
He had a strong set of beliefs that I think positively impacted a lot of people, moved the country forward, moved some of the laws forward, and just that type of impact definitely stands out to me thinking back on it.
And never to sound like corny, but I think the one thing that I've learned from Martin Luther King is it's like more than a day. You know, every day I try to get better, every day I try to step in my light or provide that essence. So I think it'll just be, I don't want to treat it as just another day because it's still, I am celebrating life, I'm celebrating legacy, but you know, luckily I've learned from him that it's an everyday thing.
For me, it's a day of reflection on where we've come from, but then it also reminds me of where we still need to go. We got a long way to go.
During the hatred, some of the most bitter times in our country, he says, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. He talks about work and he says, all work is significant. No work is insignificant. And he said, work that uplifts humanity should be done with painstaking excellence.
So our slogan must not be burn, baby, burn. It must be build, baby, build. Organize, baby, organize.
I think MLK had a greater impact on racial equality than anyone ever in my lifetime. When he was assassinated, I was 7 years old, so I was young and naive enough to maybe not grasp what it all meant. But as I grew older, just began to realize what a positive impact he had had on our world.
Has a super profound impact on just social injustice and racial injustice, but also just how to be a leader and how to lead through your actions and lead the right way.
I can't shake that Martin Luther King died at the age of 39 trying to say to people, and I know it's been coined and sometimes it's cliche-ish, can't we just get along?
I think we find ourselves in 2022 at a really interesting juxtaposition. I really think about what Dr. King would think about where we are as a people and as a country right now. And I challenge myself to think that we can do better.
We can shape and make this into the world we desire to be. But the first thing you do need is a vision, is a dream, or some goals, in that order. You need a vision, some dreams, a goal, but then you turn that vision, that dream, and that goal into a plan. How do I craft this plan to something that's going to benefit me, that's going to benefit my community?
Be able to be around each other and not care about the color of our skin, you know, realize that we're all human beings and we all live in life for a purpose. So
understanding that, you know, we're all committed and we're all together, you know, we're just really, we're responsible for each other.
So I would just challenge everybody to do better, to take care of your people, to take care of yourselves, to take care of your community, and really embody whatever it is that you believe in and shine. So
He never wanted us to give up. So I would want to pass on to others, never give up on the vision and never give in to the hatred and the racism in any shape, form, or fashion, and that no matter what, you keep moving forward.
Hope you all were as motivated by that video to think about what does today mean to you. Up next, we will have Karen Kuhn of Nationwide, our presenting sponsor for this morning's 9th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Prayer Breakfast. Karen?
Good morning. I'm Karen Kuhn, and I'm deeply honored to be joining you on behalf of Nationwide on this very special day. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Jelani Cobb. With wit, style, and pulp culture creed, Jelani is one of the cleverest voices in today's conversations around race issues. A staff writer for The New Yorker, he's an expert on how race, politics, and the popular culture intersects in America, and is known for sharing his brilliant opinions on current events in real time. For example, Jelani is featured in the recent hit Netflix documentary 13, which explores the state of mass incarceration in America. Author of the highly acclaimed book, The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, he also writes on a more pressing and somber issues like police shootings, subsequent riots, and the public response. As a preeminent voice on race and injustice, Jelani eloquently explores local and up-to-the-minute events, how they fit into the complex web of racism in America, and how to push towards equity. Let's give a warm welcome to Jelani.
So I want to say thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm happy to be with you, virtually. I remember thinking that when the Reverend gave the invocation and said that he wanted us to contagiously spread Dr. King's vision, I thought I would gladly trade that kind of contagiousness for the kind of contagiousness that's forcing us to have these events virtually right now. I really want to start by talking about Dr. King and the relevance, the immediacy of the work that he began and the immediacy of his message and his applicability to the moment that we're in right now. This was easily discerned just last week when we saw President Biden give the speech that he gave in Georgia, Dr. King's home state in Atlanta, just a few blocks from the home where Dr. King was raised. And in it, he was pressing the cause of voting rights and pointing to the not only moral, but national democratic imperative to pass some sort of legislation that will uphold and protect the right to vote in the face of restrictions that are making it increasingly difficult for people to access the ballot. And it was almost as if we had seen an element of history being drafted into the present as we heard the president give this speech. It reminded me of my own time living in the state of Georgia. Now, I have a complicated history and complicated relationship with that state. My earliest memory in life, or one of my earliest memories in life, was my father taking me into the voting booth with him. I was born and raised in Queens, New York. And he took me into the voting booth with him in 1976 to vote in the presidential election. And I had no idea what this was, just an excursion to my young mind, an excursion with my father, a chance to spend time with my father. But I didn't understand that my father, who was a native of Georgia, wanted to impress upon me the importance of voting because it was something that he was not allowed to do. His father never took him into a polling place with him in his home. Had my father as a young person attempted to vote, he could very likely have lost his life in the small town of Hazelhurst, Georgia. And so my relationship with the understanding of politics and our relationship to the right to vote begins there. But as an adult, I moved to Georgia. My first job was teaching, first academic job was teaching at Spelman College in Atlanta. And after some time there, I purchased a home. And I was really excited about this home. And I had a yard, I had all these ideas of what I was going to do with it. So this little cluster of leaves that were off in a corner, and I hardly paid any attention to it. And something came up and I was going out of town for about a week or so. And when I came back, strangely enough, this cluster of weeds had grown all the way across the back of the yard. I said, this is strange. I don't know what this is. And then I got busy with work, and I come back a few days later and I see that these weeds, really vines, had grown even farther and had now grown up around the fence post and lashed the gate shut. And so I cut some of this away, and a few days later, it was right back. And so I talked to my neighbor and I said, I don't know what this is. What's going on there? And she said, oh, that's kudzu. And I was like, what's kudzu? She said, oh, it's an invasive vine. And I was like, yeah, I tried to get rid of it. But she was like, oh, no, you're not going to get rid of kudzu like that. Kudzu grows up to 1 foot per day. I was like, a foot per day? That's astounding. What am I going to do? And so she says, well, the thing with kudzu is that you have to trace it all the way back to its roots. And you think that you've torn up the roots, you likely haven't. You have to go further and further, and you have to get a shovel and dig down, and then you will find a hub where the vine sprouts out in many directions from this one central hub, and then you pull that up and burn it. I thought about the kudzu as I heard President Biden give the speech last week about voting rights, that we believed, or we allowed ourselves to believe, that we, by pulling away the leaves and the visible surface elements of white supremacy, that we had gotten to the root of the problem. But like the kudzu, after a time, it sprung back and grew with shocking velocity, and is now threatens to lash shut the gate of opportunity for many in our communities and the most vulnerable in our communities. When we talk about this language, when I say this language, we have a kind of reaction to it. And I know that I speak and I write a lot about race. And so there's the possibility that people look and say, oh, well, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But it's really much more central than that. It's difficult for us to grasp properly the extent to which our history as a nation, and therefore our present circumstances as a nation, have been shaped by this dynamic of white supremacy. I'll illustrate it by giving you this one story. Several years ago, I gave a speech in Maine. I was invited up to give a Martin Luther King Day speech, and I spoke at a college. I was very well received. The people of New England were as hospitable and as nice as they are reputed to be. And I spoke in a beautiful chapel. And I came in, a sitting Senator Angus King had come out to listen, to hear the talk. And I climbed to the podium and said, I'd like to thank you. This is a wonderful event. I'm humbled. And your state only exists because of white supremacy. And people looked at me for a moment and didn't know where I was going. And then they thought, oh, 1820, when Missouri wanted to enter the Union, and it would have been the 12th slave state, would have tipped the balance in the favor of slaveholding states in the Senate and created an adverse reaction among the states that did not favor the expansion of slavery. And Henry Clay, the great compromiser, cut a deal, organized a deal in which a portion of Massachusetts would be carved out and would become a state of its own called Maine, largely to counterbalance the political effect of allowing another slave state, Missouri, to enter the Union. This happened in 1820. So the origins of the state connected to this question of white supremacy and slavery, and whether or not, how many places in the United States would allow people to own human beings. And so I gave the talk in Maine. It was well received. And I left, went to the airport, and I flew to Florida, where I was also speaking that week. When I spoke to the group at Florida State University, I told them what I'd said in Maine. And they were like, wow, shock. And I said, well, lest you feel too smug, let's not forget about 1820, when the upstart general, Andrew Jackson, invaded what was then the Spanish territory, largely at the behest of slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina, who were worried about the fact that their chattel property in human beings, that Black people were escaping from their states and being given shelter among the indigenous communities of Florida, the Spanish possession. And in so doing, Andrew Jackson provoked an international incident. In a hasty bit of rearguard diplomacy, the Spanish crown and the American presidency negotiated a deal by which Spain sold the territory to the United States for $15 million. But slavery is in the middle of all of this, as are the rights of the indigenous people, the indigenous population of Florida. And so I told them this and they were like, wow. And I said, but you shouldn't feel particularly bad about this, because we could talk also about those 13 states that in total or in some portion were carved out of the Louisiana Purchase and came about as a result of the slave revolt in Haiti that became to be known as the Haitian Revolution, and motivated Napoleon to make the fire sale offer that he made to Thomas Jefferson, which became the Louisiana Purchase. And so this question directly connects to there. We could talk about California, which was not allowed to enter the Union until 1850, and it came at the price of creating a federal bureaucracy that was charged with tracking down fugitive slaves and dragging them back into bondage. That was the deal that was cut in order for California to enter the Union as a free state. We could talk about Texas. In Texas, when we talk about the Confederacy and the fact that 11 states fought to preserve the right to own human beings, except Texas fought 2 wars for that right. Because the reason that the Texans seceded from Mexico, the Americans who were living in Mexico seceded and created their own independent nation in the first place, was largely motivated by the fact that Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, and there were increasing tensions between the Americans who refused to abolish, to emancipate the enslaved Africans who they brought with them for the purpose of harvesting cotton and creating an economic boom in what was then the northeastern portion of Mexico. In fact, when the 36-30 compromise comes about, because of that Missouri compromise that says that slavery cannot be permitted above this line, Texas actually surrenders a strip of land that becomes effectively a unincorporated, they called no man's land, eventually became a portion of Oklahoma. But they gave up this land rather than allow that there be territory within the state where slavery was prohibited. And so our geography, our basic geography is connected to this. Our basic founding fundamental documents reflect these prerogatives. Protections for the transatlantic slave trade, as we know in the Constitution. The 3/5 compromise, which has a direct impact on the reason that Dr. King had to lead a campaign for voting rights in the first place. In that clause, which we've heard about and seen, but we haven't really discussed what it did mechanically and how it operated within the Constitution. When the framers of the Constitution came to the question of political representation, and they said that the House of Representatives would be determined by the size of your population, the question of slavery immediately arose. The South then, as now, was more sparsely populated than the North was. But they did have a large population of enslaved Black people. Should you count these people who can't vote after you just fought a war around the idea of no taxation without representation? Or do you not count these people and anger Southerners who recognize that they will be at a distinct political disadvantage? The compromise was that they would count 3/5 or 60% of these people. And so on the verge of the Civil War, there were about 5 million white people in the South and about 4 million enslaved Black people in the South. But of those 4 million enslaved Black people, 2.5 million were being counted in the census, which meant that the 5 million whites had the political power of 7.5 million people, more than 50%, a 50% increase over what their rightful political representation would have been. That's why, on the verge of the Civil War, the South has enough power to force the hand of national politics for that entire decade leading up to 1861. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Black voting rights come about as an imperative, not simply to protect emancipation, but to protect the nation itself. What I mean by that is this. The Civil War wreaks havoc on the American nation, but particularly the American South. It is our bloodiest war. More than 750,000 people die during the course of this war. To make sure that we understand what that means, in 19th century warfare, that is almost double the number of people who died during World War II, which was modern, industrial, mechanized 20th century warfare. We would have to fight Vietnam about 12 times to get to the number of casualties that there were in the course of the American Civil War. Tremendously bloody, devastating affair. At the end of it, Lincoln's Republican Party has one priority. The Lincoln administration and the Republican Party have a sole priority, which is to make sure that the South cannot reassert the kind of political power that allowed it to tear the country in half again. And Lincoln, who in 1858, in the course of the debates with Stephen Douglas, and I have to say Stephen Douglas because I saw the reference that was going around in the legislation that said that he had debated Frederick Douglass, which that's not who the Lincoln Douglas debates were in reference to. He and Frederick Douglass did have many private debates, but the Lincoln Douglas debates of 1858 were between Abraham Lincoln and Senator Stephen Douglas. But in 1858, Abraham Lincoln said that he was not in favor, had never been in favor of making voters of Negroes. What changed? Well, by 1865, Lincoln understood that only Black voting rights could stand between the present, in which the forces that sought to secede from the Union had been vanquished, and the past, in which they had the disproportionate power that had led to the war in the first place. And so he toyed with this idea prior to his assassination to say that maybe former Black Union soldiers should be given the right to vote, or maybe quote unquote very intelligent Blacks should be given the right to vote. But eventually the Republican Party realizes that there has to be enfranchisement of male voters. The reason they choose male voters across racial lines is the fact that because so many white men died in the course of the Civil War, there were more white women voters in the South than there were white men. And they worried that by giving the right to vote to women at the aftermath of the Civil War, they would have created a South that was even more politically powerful than it had been before the war. And so this is the deal that's cut. Black people were given the right to vote in the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, in order to be a counterbalance to a white supremacist movement that threatened to destroy the United States. That's how this right to vote comes about. With the presumption, correct, it turns out, that these newly enfranchised voters would vote for the party of Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans, not for the party that represented the quote unquote solid South, overwhelmingly the party of the former slaveholders, the Democrats. And so it's at the end of the Civil War, it's at the end of Reconstruction, the period that follows the Civil War, that a reborn white supremacist movement, the movement that was lionized and romanticized in the film Birth of a Nation, began the gritty work of removing the ballot from the hands of Black people. This required violence. It required murder. It required mass spectacle and intimidation. It required legal mechanisms and extra legal mechanisms that made it difficult for people to gain access to the vote. Literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, one ingenious and devious mechanism called the white primary, in which only the primary elections were segregated. Black people were allowed to vote in general elections, but as long as you made sure that there was a white supremacist agenda in among the primary candidates, it didn't really matter what happened in general elections. The white primary survived well into the 20th century, until a Supreme Court case in 1944 called Smith v. Allwright struck it down, which was argued by a young attorney by the name of Thurgood Marshall. But this is how we move into the 20th century. When we talk about Dr. King and the movement that arose in Montgomery, it is operating in direct contrast to these currents in American history. In 1955, and it is important that we remind especially our young people of this fact, when the Montgomery bus boycott arose, there's the presumption that they sought to end segregation on public transportation. They did not. Their initial request was only a more humane form of segregation. As you recall, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. We know that there was a Jim Crow section. White people sat in one place, Black people sat in another place. But Alabama had a particular kind of Jim Crow on its public transportation in which there was no stable Jim Crow area. That there was a white area on an empty bus, a white area and a Black area. As the bus filled up, if there were more white people who needed seats, they would move the marker further back and Black people would have to get up to allow white people to sit down. So in theory, you could have had a bus in which there was no Jim Crow section, but there were all white people sitting down and all Black people standing up. Rosa Parks refused to comply with this. The initial demand was to get rid of the indignity that forced people to give up their seats and simply have a more dignified form of disrespect imposed upon the community. But it's only through organizing that they began to realize, one, that the intransigence of the city fathers in Montgomery would not give them an inch. And so there's a bargaining position. They said, well, we're going to go for the end of segregation altogether. And it was through the work of organizing that they realized that the objective really should be the end of segregation altogether on public transportation. It was upon the victory in Montgomery that they came to understand the possibilities of a broader national movement that sought civil rights gains, legislation that would prohibit discrimination on a federal level. And that was achieved in 1964 over the longest filibuster in Senate history to that point, in which Democrats held the floor for more than 60 days to prevent this legislation from coming to a vote. And so this happens. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 passes, and it creates a new vista of possibilities. But it also poses new conflicts. And people come to understand another thing, that the movement is a constant effort at revising your expectations and your objectives as the events that transpire let you know just how far you have to dig to get to the kudzu roots of this structure that has disadvantaged people historically and in their contemporary context. And so after the landmark achievement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it became apparent that these rights could not be protected without voting rights. As long as Black communities were disempowered politically, there was no guarantee that this Civil Rights Act would not be reversed by later legislation. And this is where the long difficult, and bloody campaign to procure protections for voting rights begins. And it's in the course of this that Dr. King gives a speech at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March. This is after the campaign in which the civil rights movement workers were attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. Famously, the later Congressman John Lewis is bludgeoned nearly to death at the hands of a police officer on that bridge. Jimmy Lee Jackson, one of the young activists, is killed during this campaign. Viola Liuzzo, who was a young white woman who was an activist, is killed during the course of this campaign. And so they arrive at the conclusion of this march in Montgomery and hold a talk, a rally on the grounds just outside, technically, just outside the grounds of the state capitol, within earshot of the governor, George Wallace. And so in the course of his speech, Dr. King, and this is not one of his better known speeches, but is one of the speeches that we should pay more attention to. And I wrote about it recently in the New Yorker. In the course of this speech, Dr. King talks about the rationale for removing the vote from Black people after the end of the Civil War in the first place, after the end of Reconstruction. He said that the Bourbon interests, and these were the interests of elite whites, the powerful industrial representatives in the South, he said the Bourbon powers understood that if they wanted to enact a political and economic agenda that benefited them and that disadvantaged poor people across all racial lines, then they had to first remove the ballot from the hands of Black people. This was part of the agenda. And in order to do this, they whipped up a campaign of white supremacy and violence and enlisted white working class and white poor people in the cause of disenfranchising Black voters. And what resulted from this were policies that drove down the wages of all workers in the South. They kept people of all backgrounds in the South poor, disempowered. So when we have our conversation now about things that are vitally needed in this country, we look at the dividing line that COVID has revealed, which stripped bare the facade of equality in the country and showed how a virus that has no partisan affiliation whatsoever somehow found its way disproportionately into the poorest communities and most vulnerable communities, where we saw fatality rates and infection rates that were sometimes double or triple what they were in other communities. We see that we have no Family Leave Act, and that people are struggling to both raise their families and earn money to feed those families. It's an echo of the same thing that Dr. King talked about in 1965. There's another point that I want to make before I get into our final kind of contemporary implications of this. In the 20th century, the situation that we talked about ahead of the war actually got worse. Because there was something called the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment did lots of things, one of which was to get rid of the 3/5 compromise. It meant that all people would now be counted as full individuals in the census. And this was great when all people had access to the ballot. But what wasn't great was when people were lynched and intimidated and legislated out of their ability to vote, but still counted in the census. So it meant that the South was proportionately more powerful than it had been before the war. This is reflected in one simple fact. Between 1933 and 1995, the Democratic Party controlled the House of Representatives, and for much of that time, the Senate as well. And this is a result, with the exception of one 2-year period, a brief 2-year period during the Truman administration. The House of Representatives was in the hands of the Democratic Party for that entire time. And this is owed directly to the fact that the South was so disproportionately represented prior to 1965, disproportionately represented by Black people, while Black people were not allowed to vote. And so this is what's at stake. We're talking about these issues of Dr. King's ideas and what he meant, but we're also looking at the contemporary implications of people who have attempted to hold on to power. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act is signed. It is tremendously influential. At the time, there were 5 Black people in the House of Representatives. There are currently 57. At the time, there were less than 1,000 African Americans who had been elected to political office across the country. There are currently about 12,000. The Voting Rights Act transforms the face of American society. It's one of the cornerstone aspects of our democracy. That same year, 1965, just a few weeks apart, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. The Immigration Reform Act allowed us to get rid of racist quotas, and I don't say racist quotas as kind of my own opinion or color commentary on the matter. The people who designed the 1924 Immigration Act intended for it to be racist. Literally said that there were people of different stocks with different kinds of IQs, and they did not want it to be possible for those people to become part of the United States. It's what the law, the inspiration for the law was. And it held sway until 1965. When President Johnson signed the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, which literally changed the face of the country, allowed people from Latin America and Africa and the Caribbean in South Asia and East Asia, places where it would have been very difficult to immigrate from prior, allowed them to come in numbers in which they had not ever come to the United States before. It is no coincidence that in the midst of conflicts, which have culminated in astounding acts like the assault on the United States Capitol in an attempt to overturn an election, we have an unbroken streak of nonviolent transitions of power that go from the first time the Federalists, John Adams, turned over the Oval Office to the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson, all the way up to 2020, when we had large-scale violence in an attempt to overturn the results of an election. It's not coincidental that in a moment such as that one, we have conflict around the 2 things that happened in the summer of 1965. Our liberal immigration policies and our legislation that protects the right to vote. We've seen this legislation eviscerated in 2013 by the Supreme Court in the Shelby v. Holder case. Since then, we've seen a raft of policies that have come into effect that have made it more difficult for people to gain access to the ballot. Studies from think tanks and policy groups, academics, have consistently pointed to these obstacles falling disproportionately on the shoulders of communities of color. In the decades since the Voting Rights Act was authorized, it expanded. It became even more democratic. For instance, the Voting Rights Act is responsible for ballot materials being made available in every language that is spoken in any given community. So just a few months ago, when I reenacted the right that my father did with me, and I took my daughter with me to the polling place as I went to vote in the New York City mayoral elections, one of the first things that she noticed was that the ballot had the names of the candidates in all sorts of different languages. And I explained to her that is so people who are most comfortable in speaking different languages will be able to participate in the election as well. We have the Voting Rights Act to thank for this. It also became crucial and key to protecting the rights of indigenous communities, where Native American voters had consistently found that there were obstacles making it more difficult for them to exercise their right to vote. And the Voting Rights Act became a key element in protecting their rights. So this is where we stand. It's not difficult to see the relevance of Dr. King's message. It's not difficult to understand the dynamic that he was trying to articulate as he tried to excavate the history to make clear the motives of people operating in his particular moment. When he talked about the disastrous implications, the disastrous policy implications for communities once the right to vote had been stripped away from African Americans. So the work that Dr. King did is unfinished. The work that is within our hands. It's within our time. It falls upon our shoulders. And this is difficult, this is sobering. Sometimes people say this is depressing. But I'll end by pointing to this. Dr. King maintained a kind of recalcitrant optimism. He wasn't the only one. As a matter of fact, in that speech, he quotes a woman who he talks to after the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. And he was an elderly woman, and he wanted to know how she was doing. And she said, well, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested. And he said that in her ungrammatical profundity, she was explaining the paradox that people were physically tired, but their souls had been replenished by the work that they were doing. It was the work of generating inspiration for themselves and for subsequent generations. It is the recalcitrant, what we as young people were called hard-headed, is the hard-headed optimism. Not the kind of foolish optimism that says, oh, everything's going to be okay, but the kind of wizened, steely, and understanding, comprehending optimism that sees the obstacles ahead of you, but nonetheless holds faith in the possibility of surmounting them. Not the guarantee, but the possibility. The last thing I'll say is this. When Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize, he gives a speech in Oslo. And in that speech, he talks about the phrase, "we shall overcome," which has become associated with the movement. And he explains that people think that this is a kind of statement of defiance, or that they're singing this song to the people who are opposing them, or to the hostile crowds that are on the sidelines jeering them as they march, or any of those things. But he actually says it's not that. It's more of a mantra, that they're singing it to themselves. They sing it as a means of lightening the burden that they carry. He says those words would give their feet renewed strength as they marched on toward the city of freedom. And then he said, when our days grow dreary and our nights grow darker than 1,000 midnights, we will nonetheless know that we are witnessing the creative tension of a genuine civilization being born. The civilization that Dr. King aspired to has not yet been born. That work remains in our hands. But it's through his example and through this recalcitrant faith and optimism that we shall overcome, and that work will be beneficial to the generations that come after us. Thank you.
Wow, bravo, Dr. Cobb. mic drop. I don't know if you can see all of these comments that are coming in, but your words are definitely impactful. We greatly appreciate that. Looks like everyone is greatly enjoying that. The video will be later available on the YMCA's website. You are tuned into the 9th annual Martin Luther King Jr. Prayer Breakfast. We just heard from the dynamic Dr. Cobb, and we will make sure that video is available. If you do feel so inclined and would like to contribute to the fundraiser, you can go to dmymca.org/MLK donate. Up next, we are going to have question and answer session with Dr. Cobb, so you do not want to miss this. Our first question or panelist that will offer a question is Mr. Tim Johnson. Tim Johnson is Behavioral Health Services Coordinator for Des Moines Public Schools. He has worked for the organization for 4 years. He enjoys sports, exercising, and time with his family. He holds a degree in social work, criminology from Northern Iowa, and a master's degree in social work from the University of Iowa. Tim?
Oh, yeah, good morning, good morning. So I just want to say thank you, Dr. Cobb, for your time and that wonderful keynote, man. It touched my heart, and I hope that it touched the heart of others, man, because this work is unfinished and we still have a lot to go. So my question, man, I'm coming to you from public education. Do you have any strategies to talk about race/Black history in classrooms where teachers don't feel comfortable and or worried that they might get reprimanded for doing so?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things there. The first is that I think that we have to do a better job of conveying. One of the things I think people tend to think when we have these conversations is that people who are raising critical perspectives are trying to, quote unquote, tear the country down, or trying to mine history for things, the worst things. But I would say teams watch their game tape for what they got wrong. When you scored a touchdown, that's great. Those are things that you knew how to do. But you watch your game tape, the way we review history, for the things that you got wrong, to understand what you can do better. And so it's out of a sense of attempting to protect the country, to better the country. I think that has to be a point that we convey more effectively than we have. The other is that I think that when I talk about this, I always emphasize that there really are no blameless and no faultless individuals, and therefore we have no blameless or faultless communities. If we were to talk about the rights in the LGBTQ plus community, if we were talking about the disability rights, if we're talking about the full equality and equalization of rights of women in this society, there's a whole array of different people that we could talk about who have had to struggle to achieve full inclusion in this society. And it's not necessarily I will say this. I think it's important that we understand that the biggest obstacle to being a phenomenal society is believing that you are one already. And those are the things. Now, more logistically speaking, for people who are worried and afraid about having these discussions in class, that is going to be something that's going to be a fight about politics, quite frankly. In Oklahoma, the legislature is now trying to get books out of the libraries, the public libraries. People are trying to restrict what you can teach about race in such ways, and using the kind of colorblind neutral language to say something that sounds like it's beneficial to African Americans, but is actually a mechanism that disempowers the ability to even talk about what has happened with African Americans. And so those are political fights that people are going to have to organize and be in streets and be willing to support. There are teachers unions, which I know are getting beaten up right now, but their key job has to be protecting people who are teaching sound information, not saying that someone's coming out with some kind of crackpot theory from left field. We're talking about things that are very straightforward and established by our best scholars. And so I think that's just quite frankly what it comes down to, and what we'll have to do on this.
I don't know if you all are catching these gems or these nuggets. If you are a word nerd like me, you are just like writing profusely on those. Thank you so much, Tim, for your question. And thank you so much, Dr. Cobbs, for your answer. Quickly, I wanted to make sure that we are thanking Nationwide, our presenting sponsor, and a host of other folks that helped make this 9th Annual Prayer Breakfast possible. Dot Dash, Meredith, Athene, Bankers Trust, and Iowa Wolves. Our next panelist with a question is Bridget Cravens Neely. She is a native of Illinois and she has lived in Des Moines area for almost 30 years, where her and her husband have raised their 3 sons. She has worked and served the community tirelessly. She's opened an entertainment business, dealing with art. Bridget serves on many boards and is a leader in many organizations, such as the Epsilon Theta Sigma chapter of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, the Des Moines chapter of the Links Incorporated, the Wilkie House, and Johnston Parents for Equity and Anti-Racism. Bridget is a community advocate who is passionate about equity and inclusion for people of color, particularly in the Black community. Bridget?
Good morning, and thank you so very much, Dr. Cobb. My head is swimming right now with all of the information that you shared. There's so much to dissect right there. But my question is, being a member of the corporate community as well as the overall greater Des Moines community, my question is more focused around, the corporations that have pledged to support in the fight for social justice. There were a lot of statements, a lot of promises made in 2020. And so for yourself as an activist, what is the social justice priority that you see in 2022 that corporations should be focusing on?
I muted myself because there was a siren outside, which is, proof that I really am in New York. So, I think there are many, but I think that voting is at the center of them, because unless we have some sort of, we're looking at a seldom preceded, like very few precedents for the scale of the democratic crisis that we're encountering right now. And unless we do something that's going to bolster and protect our ability for inclusion, then we are in very dire shape. There's a whole array of things that I think also have to happen. Our healthcare system, which we understand and we see the effects of in the midst of COVID in ways that are not sustainable for people, that's crucial. We have done some work around our incarceration policies. We have a huge amount of work yet to do. And I was very excited to hear about the work that you're doing with the COVID education gap that's happening, because my fear, the thing that keeps me up at night, is that this is going to be the COVID crisis will do in education what the housing crisis did in economics, which is that there had been African-American communities that were creeping, not speeding, not sprinting, but creeping toward equity, which is being largely driven by home ownership. And then the housing crisis comes along and wipes out all of that progress. And we could see over the course, one of the kind of bright spots is that when you look at the numbers in comparison to the 1970s, achievement gaps have narrowed. The dropout rate, which, for people who are a certain age can remember, that was the fundamental fight that people were having around, education and inequality in education. The dropout rates have plummeted since those years. The Black college attendance rate has quintupled, something like that. But there were some really important signs that were happening in education, and COVID could just very easily wipe all of that out. Because where I am in Harlem, there were schools where 40% of the students never logged on once when we went to virtual learning. And so I think that all of those things are crucial, and all of those things are in front of us. They're all going to have some sort of effect. But if I had to just pick one thing, I would say that we need to be all in on voting.
In my great anticipation of hearing Dr. Cobbs and introducing the program and making sure we got started and operated in excellence in a timely manner, I forgot to inform you all that I am Shekinah and I am a proud board member of the John R. Grubb YMCA. I believe in that community and have put my efforts behind that for the past 4 years. And so we are excited to make sure that you have all of your programming needs this morning. Our next panelist with a question is Joshua Barr. Joshua Barr is a dynamic voice in our community. He has lent his time, talents, and energy to that of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion all around Des Moines. While not a native of Des Moines, he brings his extra flair and charisma to be all about that. He is the CEO of, off of mute now?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
He's the CEO of Raising the Bar Consulting Services and a former director of the Des Moines Civil and Human Rights Commission. Joshua, your question?
Thank you. And Shekinah, you failed to mention that you're also a former recipient of the Making a Difference Award for the MLK Prayer Breakfast. But first of all, Dr. Cobb, thank you. This has been excellent. I really appreciate you speaking today. Also, special thank you for your frontline documentary on the post-George Floyd conflict. I thought it was excellent. It's free on YouTube for anybody who wants to watch it. My question really is about history and policy. You touched on it somewhat throughout your speech, but throughout history, true change has not come through thoughts, prayers, and good speeches, but rather through legislative policies and programs, from the Freedmen's Bureau to the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, and federal programs through the Great Society for Head Start, for example. And King even understood this by trying to unite people through the Poor People's Campaign right before he lost his life. So my question to you is, what programs and policies do you believe we need to be pushing for at the national, but also at the local level, which is where Great Society focused, to address our original sin of racism? And how do we achieve and get people on board in that regard in such a polarized society where we can't seem to agree on anything?
So I think that there's a whole array of things. There's a lot in that question. But first, I will say I don't disregard the importance of speeches in all of this. Policy is crucial, but you know, when I was talking with Mark Morial, who's the head of the National Urban League once, and this was after the deaths of 9 people in the church in South Carolina, Emmanuel AME. And this was, you know, the funerals were happening, and we were walking along, and they announced that the state was going to remove the Confederate flag. And I just was disgusted. You know, I said, that's an empty gesture. You know, these people lost their lives, and it's nothing but symbolism. And Mark said, yeah, you know, Mark has been doing this much longer than I have. He said, yeah, but you know, sometimes those symbolic victories are what get you along to the substantial ones. You know, and sometimes those speeches are, you know, what bring you along to push for the policies. And so I think that those things are important. Now, we're talking about what policies I think need to happen. There are a lot. You know, for one, you know, we have this thing that we're calling income inequality. Years ago, people used to refer to something called class exploitation. We need our tax code, which has been the biggest expropriator of wealth from struggling communities into the pockets of relatively affluent ones. There's a great book by my friend Dorothy Brown called The Color of Wealth, and she talks about the way that the tax code operates in this sense. And I think that we really need to have you know, significant reform in that. If everything else is going to stem from that. We need to have significant improvement in the ways in which we fund our schools. We need livable wage policies. When we're looking at, you know, what the minimum wage was and what people are actually able to live on versus what the minimum wage is now, proportionately, when, you know, decades ago, we're seeing huge differences. People are not able to get by. One of the other things I think is that we need to, in terms of policy, remove private equity investment from the housing market, which is one of the reasons why people, cannot afford housing now. I was tweeting a few days ago, which I never need to do. I always say I'm not going to do this, but I was tweeting and I pointed out that my father was an electrician. My mother was a home health worker, and I realized that in order to buy the home that I grew up in, I never made enough money to buy that home until I had a PhD, tenure, and had written several books. And so we had housing policies that made it possible for people to purchase a home, to build for their families. And what we've done in many places is make housing effectively a privilege as opposed to a right. I think that we also need, in terms of policy, the questionable legality of removing the right to the ballot for people who have completed their prison sentences, which is, in Florida, directly connected. Most of those laws, in fact, throughout the South, were directly connected to efforts to remove Black people from political contention after the end of Reconstruction. And so we could just go on and talk about, all of these things, but there's no shortage of things that could help and change our situation. I think it is getting the momentum to be able to do it.
Thank you so much for that. One last question, and then we'll have your conclusion, Dr. Cobb. The question is, how do we keep these conversations alive in our communities?
I think we keep these conversations alive by doing what we're doing now. I think, I talk with people in the community all the time. Sometimes I talk to big groups of people. Sometimes I talk to small groups of people. I took an example. It was a guy I knew who was a musician years ago, and he planned this big show. And about 5 of us came, this big empty venue. He got up on the stage and he did his show, and he performed. He did the best performance that I'd seen him do for 5 people, and that was important to me because it said that you do what you do and you make a difference. You can impact small groups of people. You impact large groups of people. We go along and talk. I see in Harlem and New York, where I'm around, I will pull these young people up and ask them what they know about what's going on around them and what's happening. And so I think that when back in the time when we could do this, I would get into schools and talk with people there and say, all right, well, can I be of help to this school? Because I don't have any kids in the school, but this school is 4 blocks from me. The school's 8 blocks from me. How can I be of help to to the kids here? And time again, people are like, oh, what grade is your child in? It's like, I don't have kids here in this school, but this is my responsibility. And so I also will point this out, that we have the benefit of the struggles of people before us because we've never had more materials to make this happen. We have entire sections in bookstores crammed with historical stuff, with economic stuff, with contemporary stuff, with literature, with children's literature. There are YouTube state networks. There are a whole social media outlets. There are no shortage of ways to get access to materials to help further this conversation. And so I think in that regard, I'm actually heartened by the progress that we've made in recent years.
Thank you so much for that. Did you have any additional things that you wanted to note for your conclusion, or did you want to move forward with the award recipients?
Well, I want to say thank you. I want to say that, it's unfortunate that the world we're operating in now would be familiar to Dr. King, that the struggles that we see are familiar to Dr. King. But I also think that it's very crucial to always proceed with the understanding that our biggest battles are behind us. That's what Dr. King understood, that people who had no right to believe that they could ever be free, nonetheless fought and pursued over the course of multiple generations the goal of one day being free. And we attained that. Everything else has been comparatively smaller. And so for all of the struggles that confront us, we also have more resources and we have more history to fall back upon as a guide. And if we keep those things in mind, I think we'll be okay.
Thank you so much for that again, Dr. Cobb.
Thank you.
Karen?
Hello, I am so honored to be given the opportunity to introduce our Make a Difference Award winner, Betty C. Andrews. Noted as one of Iowa's most acclaimed leaders, Betty, through commitment to excellence, has built a reputation as a brilliant businesswoman, a powerful civil rights advocate, and a strong proponent of connecting people around education, culture, and arts. Betty finds tremendous fulfillment and success in creating, organizing, and promoting opportunities that build community. Betty is president and CEO of Betty Andrews Media, a media, events, and strategic communications firm where I'll Make Me a World in Iowa, Iowa's African American Festival, is one of her key clients. Andrews is a gifted strategist and has provided extensive coaching, branding, media consulting, and promotion for clients like Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, the United Way, Lieutenant Governor Joy Corning, Lieutenant Governor Sally Peterson and the Iowa Committee on Diversity, Drake University, the Institute for Social and Economic Development, the Iowa Status of African Americans, Civil Music, African American Museum of Iowa, Hoyt Sherman Place, Central College, the NAACP, Youth Vote Coalition, the American Red Cross, and numerous other clients. 8 years ago, Betty Andrews was elected president of the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP State Area Conference of Branches, presiding over 30 units of the organization in both states. Since then, with her vision and strategic insights, she, with the support of the units, has significantly increased the visibility, platform, and achievements of the NAACP in both states, including highly successful advocacy for law and policy changes. Through her activism, Betty understands how to demand immediate action and also how to play the long game. Whether it's quick bursting change or incremental large-scale change, change is imminent when Betty is around. Just a few of the over 15 laws and ordinances Betty has led include Iowa's first anti-racial profiling ordinance in 2019, subsequent anti-racial profiling laws in Iowa City, Coralville, and Des Moines, ban the box fair chance hiring city and county resolutions, juvenile record sealing, decreasing the penalty for crack cocaine as compared to powder cocaine, securing the right to vote for people with felony backgrounds, Iowa's More Perfect Union law, hair braiding certification, laws laying groundwork for diversifying juries, Iowa's first anti-racial profiling law passed in the University Heights, Iowa, and supporting Iowa's More Perfect Union law. In 2013, Betty founded the Iowa Summit on Justice and Disparities, a groundbreaking conference addressing the fact that Iowa ranked #1 in the nation for the number of African Americans per capita in the criminal justice system. Through this summit, Andrews and her work have applauded for helping improve the state's rankings. Andrews' list of accomplishments go on and on. She has won numerous awards and recognitions, but she would tell you that she doesn't work alone. Her success comes through working with various committee people who support her leadership and ideals. Her colleague, Roman Christopher, often says this about Betty. Betty Andrews is a national treasure located right here in Des Moines. I applaud her personal mission to ensure that Iowans understand the rich legacy, history, and culture that African Americans have. Her message is always empowering. It is my privilege to watch her affect large-scale change in so many important ways for our community. Her work affects thousands of people who may never even know her name. She always comes for change. Russell Lavelle, co-chair for the NAACP Legal Redress Committee, shares this. There is no one who has done more than Betty Andrews through her annual summits on justice and disparities and the NAACP advocacy to put the issues of racial bias in the criminal justice system and reform of mass incarceration front and center on the state's public policy agenda. The NAACP's great strength is its grassroots advocacy combined with law reform. And there is no better example of that than Betty Andrews' study and grasp of complex civil rights issues and terminology, so she can successfully lead the negotiations that resulted in the Des Moines Unbiased Policing Ordinance and could explain to the community how that law makes important first steps in reforming policing. President Andrews also led the NAACP advocacy that successfully secured the Iowa Supreme Court supervisory order that makes, for the first time in the history of Iowa, people with felony records whose citizenship rights have been restored eligible for service in the jury duty. This has been the potential to affect 160,000 Iowans. Jackie Easley McGee, a long-term friend of Betty. My friend Betty is a fearless voice for our community. She stands alongside some of the most courageous women in our history. So like Sojourner Truth, she speaks truth to power through the annual summit on justice and disparities. Like Ida B. Wells, she is persistent in the pursuit of goals of the largest and oldest and the most feared and revered civil rights organization in America, the NAACP. Like Maya Angelou, she can walk into any room, whether filled with Supreme Court justices or the incarcerated, and command attention because she is a phenomenal woman. On behalf of the YMCA of Greater Des Moines and Nationwide Insurance, I am honored to present to you the 2022 Make a Difference Award winner, Betty C. Andrews.
Well, thank you, Karen, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you also to you and to Nationwide for being the presenting sponsor of this worthy event. It is my honor to receive the YMCA's Martin Luther King Jr. Make a Difference Award today. I appreciate all those involved with today's wonderful program. Special thanks to the YMCA and particularly my friend Cam and longtime friend Leisha Barkus. The fact that you would think of me is humbling. I do not do this work for the glory, but I am fueled by the recognition that people are watching and that my work is impactful and is not in vain. Dr. Cobb, I thank God for you. What an empowering message. Thank you for walking us through this strong history, because we know that knowledge is a difference maker. And I pride myself with fighting with facts. I am disappointed that we are virtual, because that means I can't meet you in person, but hopefully our paths will come or connect one day. I also want to thank all those that walk beside me. My family, of course, Eddie, Betty, Bridget, Alexis, who is in Spain joining us, Joshua, and then Eli for his time with us. I just want to just say that I appreciate my family, because throughout this work, you can't do this by yourself. So they have often been voluntold. I also want to thank my I'll Make Me a World in Iowa team, my Betty Andrews media staff, the NAACP across both Iowa and Nebraska, the Directors Council, my Parliamentarians Club, Jack and Jill, and to the many others in the community who also reach out or come beside me and support in many ways. This is the Dr. King holiday. We know that it's a day of service, but it's not just a day. It's an opportunity to recommit ourselves to justice for the year. And that's what I am doing with this day. As Dr. Cobb mentioned earlier, we shall overcome. And I just want to emphasize that it is the we have to do this together. And if I can just do my part to walk in this path, not necessarily in Dr. King's big footsteps, but to walk into this path, that's enough for me. When this award was announced on my on Facebook, and when it was announced that I would be receiving this award, I received a lot of comments and support on Facebook and other social media. But I wanted to just highlight that Dr. Carolyn King Cannon quoted scripture, and I think this sums it up for me. She says, "You are the fulfillment of Micah 6:8. He has showed you, O man or woman, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do it justly, and to love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God." And again, for me, that sums it up. I am honored to serve Iowa, and I look forward to many more years, many more victories to come, because I know that we shall overcome, and we all can make a difference. Thank you.
Congratulations again, Betty, on the award. For our closing prayer, we will have community advocate and Pastor Alex Hanna.
Hey, thank you so much this morning to Dr. Cobb. We are really, really overwhelmed with the information that you have provided us, and what a great, great kickoff for such a historical event. Being a product of Memphis City School System, when you were talking and sharing this powerful history, I thought about my days walking down Beale Street at the end of Dr. King's final march in Memphis, as we cut school or left school to join into that march, not knowing that we were part of history. I love the history that was articulated today. We thank God for you, Sister Betty. We thank God for you. What a wonderful, well-deserved award from the YMCA, and for all the work that you have done. Let me just close this by saying that as believers, if we want to really make a difference in the world, we must build bridges of racial reconciliation. And how do we do that? We must do that by understanding the truth. And Jesus himself said, know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. I believe the writer does not mean that we are colorblind in Galatians 3:26, when he speaks of in Christ Jesus, we are all children of God through faith. There is no Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male nor female, for we are all one in Christ. Again, I believe that the writer does not mean that we take a colorblind approach to the community and a nation that we live in. Paul wasn't suggesting that aspect of our gender or racial identity aren't important. In fact, what he was emphasizing was that the unity that is within us is found in the richness of our diversity. We all have been given different gifts. We all are different. We all are different in what we have been given, but we are of the same body. And in the family of God, we must become color brave, colored caring, colored honoring, and not color blind. We have to recognize the image of God in one another. We have to love despite and even because of our differences. So let me close this beautiful session this morning by saying that I believe that the real beauty of our nation resides basically in the ashes of our country's history. And that means history of racism. But the family of God must first acknowledge the ashes without looking back, without understanding the truth of our country's history. It's difficult for us to move forward in a healthy way. That's why I'm so grateful to God today to hear Dr. Cobb really articulate what the truth is really all about. For my brothers and sisters, truth frees us to grow. Truth frees us to see. Truth frees us to be brave. It frees us to be aware. It frees us from the bondage of racial sins. It frees us to have courage for the difficult conversations that are in front of us. As a matter of fact, truth is the foundation of awareness, and awareness is the first step in the process of reconciliation. So with that, I am so grateful to God for this opportunity. I'm so grateful to God to have been a part of this wonderful, wonderful celebration. But let me just say, acknowledgement of the truth of our country's history and racism leads us toward lament. Lamenting sometimes horrific facts about our country may leave us without an understanding of where we go next. So again, we should be agents of reconciliation. It's never too late for us to acknowledge the racial injustice. As Dr. Martin Luther King says, it's never too late to do the right thing. So let us do the right thing by building bridges of reconciliation with one another and understanding the truth that is in front of us, a truth that right now is under attack. So we thank God for that. So let us begin this morning. Let us start this journey. Let us start this new hope in a new year. Let us rejoice in a new hope, because we know that if we build bridges of reconciliation, we know that we will be able to confront anything that is before us. Let us pray. Our wise and eternal God, we come today to say thank you for what we have witnessed today. Thank you for what we have heard. Thank you for what we have even seen today on Zoom. We just thank you for these leaders of this great organization. We thank you for our guest speaker today. We ask God's blessings upon him. We thank you for the recipient of this Make a Difference award. And above all, we just thank you for allowing us to live, move, and have our being this morning. We thank you for the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. We thank you as we march forward. We thank you for those that came on today, for those that participated today, and for those that will move forward to make our nation a better world. In the name of our Lord and Savior, we do pray, and we thank you for all things, because every good and perfect gift comes from you. In his name we pray. Thank God and amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to our speaker, Dr. Cobb, to Betty Andrews, our awardee. Thank you to Nationwide, our presenting sponsor, our silver sponsors, Dash, Meredith, supporting sponsors, Athene, Bankers Trust, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I have been your host, Shekinah Young, past award recipient and board member of the John R. Grubb YMCA, and it is my privilege to share this prayer breakfast with you this morning. I hope that the over 200 participants we had today were pleased and took home something to help them continue in the fight. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.